Hello and welcome to Natasha Explains It All. Today's episode is going to be the first of a new series I want to start called Book Report, where I share recommendations of books that I've read or audiobooks that I've listened to. I love reading, I've always loved reading, and I figured this would be a fun thing to incorporate into the podcast to share my love of reading with listeners. And also, I think, if you are someone who enjoys reading or listening to audiobooks, like me, you're always on the hunt for good recommendations, right? And it's always helpful when someone else can do a little bit of the filtering for you. Um, so you know that something is worth jumping into. So I want to try that out. So for today's first book report, my recommendation is actually a memoir called You Can't Be Serious by the actor Cal Penn. And Cal Penn is most famous for the TV show House and the movie series Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. And I've actually never seen either of those, or maybe I've seen clips. But certainly, it's not because I was a fan of this actor that brought me to this book. I actually listened to it as an audiobook. But it was through someone else that I follow on social media, someone named Alok Menon, who is a queer activist, poet, public speaker, comedian. Alok is amazing and very inspiring, and is doing a lot to address, uh, anti-trans violence as well as diversity in the fashion industry and all kinds of things. So Alok is um, someone that I follow and I find very inspiring and insightful. And Alok had posted uh, a recommendation about this memoir, You Can't Be Serious by Cal Penn. And so, based on that recommendation, I decided to give it a try. And I'm so glad that I did. So, You Can't Be Serious is a memoir by Cal Penn. And it, if you listen to the audiobook, it's actually read by the author, which I think is always so cool, right? Because you get just so much more of a sense of the person's personality, and it just makes it so much more personal, right? Because a memoir already is an incredibly personal piece of writing. But then it's just a totally different level when you have the author read it. So if you have the chance to listen to the audiobook version, I recommend it because, yeah, the author reads it. And You Can't Be Serious talks about Cal's experience as an actor. That's the main focus of the memoir, and particularly focusing on his experience dealing with racism in Hollywood. And it's not it's not a dated memoir. Cal was born in the late 70s, and is still very much acting to this day. And so the main anecdotes and experiences that he's talking about are from the 90s and the 2000s, um, and there so really not that long ago. And it's really fascinating, and he has the ability to communicate some really messed up things without it being such a depressing read that it makes it hard to get through. He has that great balance in making it funny in the same, in the same vein, like being able to communicate a very deep and serious message while using comedy as the medium to convey that serious message, which is an incredible skill. And he talks about his experience of being Indian American and how that influenced his ability to get jobs and what kind of jobs he could get, and his trajectory in Hollywood. Um, he talks about even his name, for example. So he adopted Cal Penn as a stage name in the hopes that that would help him get better positions because his actual name is Kalpin Suresh Modi. And so he ended up taking his first name, Kalpin, and separating it and creating Kalpen as his stage name to help him get more jobs, which is, a pretty common thing, right, in the Hollywood world. And just a little bit about his background. He was born, as I said, in the late 70s. He was born in New Jersey, grew up in New Jersey. His parents are immigrants from India. And he talks about his experience of pursuing the arts route while coming from a culture and a family that, really discouraged the arts and seeing it as an impractical pathway. And yeah, the systemic racism that he faced in Hollywood. And, even talking about how, again, uh, how common these things are even today. So one of the things he talks about is brown face, which I have to admit was something I wasn't as familiar with. I've been more familiar with blackface, which for those who may not be familiar with, is the long-standing practice of white actors blackening their faces to play usually very stereotypical depictions of Black people. And through this memoir, You Can't Be Serious, I also learned about the practice of brown face, which is again when white actors would use brown makeup to make themselves pass for either Latino or Indian or Middle Eastern or some other type of ethnicity rather than just casting people from those actual backgrounds. And how he ran into this in many, many, many auditions that he went to. And so again, this is not like old news from like the 1920s. No, this is from this century that this practice is still very much alive and ongoing. And he gives a really fascinating and modern example of systemic racism as well in talking about a show that he piloted for a major network, and how basically it was set up to fail in comparison to the other piloted TV shows that had predominantly white casts, while his show had a much more diverse cast because the network invested only a fraction of the marketing budget for his show in comparison to the other shows. So basically setting it up to fail because the network wasn't putting in the same resources, the same number of advertisements, the same amount of money to get the message out about the new show. And so the show ended up being cut, after a season. Um, and so that example is really fascinating. And he also talks about, which is something I didn't know at all, he spent time working in the Obama White House. And so he talks about, for those who are more of like political nerds, even if you're not, it's really interesting and rare, to have a Hollywood actor who then becomes a staffer, in the White House, and talking about actually how his skills translated and what a positive experience that was for him, and getting insight into the Obama era and how much that stood in stark contrast to prior administrations, and how that also related to um, uh, how much, yeah, that administration reflected what he wanted Hollywood to look like, and how Hollywood to this day remains so much of an old white boys club, um, and the barriers that are faced by actors who don't fit that traditional mold and have to work harder to even be considered, much less cast. And how much stereotypes still play into how much non-white uh, actors have to deal with. He talks a lot about uh, being being required to adopt an Indian accent for his roles, even though he doesn't have an Indian accent. He was born and raised in the United States. He is Indian American, but he doesn't have an accent. And he talks about, a really fascinating angle on that, that it's not only bothersome because it was, in all of those situations, was clearly an effort to reinforce stereotypes about Indian people and to laugh at Indian people for a perceived funny accent. But he also talks about how it was an example of like creative laziness. He talks about how this was something that he continues to fight, that the reliance on stereotypes and tropes is actually a lack of creativity, because you could write stuff that's actually way funnier if you weren't relying on, jokes about spices and turbans and, head wobbling and the other types of stereotypes and tropes that came up again and again in his auditions and performances. So anyway, I want to keep these book report episodes relatively short. So I won't spend too much more time on this. But You Can't Be Serious by Cal Penn was a really interesting and really funny memoir about what it's like to be the son of immigrants and become a Hollywood star and also work for the White House and also deal with systemic racism while also um, maintaining an incredibly positive attitude. And that really shines through, and I think is admirable, but really difficult given just like the constant barrage um, of barriers that were put in place simply for who he is. And what I think is interesting as well is that uh, Cal is also gay and talks about meeting his partner, who now is, I believe, his fiance. And he talks about how they met and their relationship, but it isn't a major theme of the memoir. So I thought that was an interesting approach as well. And so, but it even speaks to the further intersectionality of Cal, as well as of many people. And, uh, and I'm guessing that may have come up as well in terms of barriers he may have faced in the industry or perhaps with his family. But it isn't something that is explored in the memoir. And then lastly, I'll say that one of the stories that I mentioned, that one of the examples that he gives of the ongoing racism in Hollywood is about, yeah, a show that he tried to launch. And that show is available on his website, but you have to pay for it. It's called Sunnyside, and it's such a bummer that it was canceled, because it seems like just this really cool premise and sounds hilarious. And it's basically around like this this guy who ends up teaching U.S. citizenship classes to make some money, and his interactions with all of his immigrant students and their experience coming to the United States and going through this citizenship course. So anyway, it sounded really interesting, and it's really a bummer that the network cut it so soon and undermined it, from the very start. Um, yeah. So I will leave it there. I think it's really funny, really interesting, um, and particularly for someone that I don't really is not someone that I already followed, and then getting insight into his story for someone who's been in various high profile positions from Hollywood to the White House, and learning about his perspective in a really easy to read and easy to listen to memoir about his story, and how much progress has been made and how much progress still needs to happen. And I think, yeah, when we hear personal stories and personal experiences, I think that can help expand, our understanding of the world and what people go through. And I think he does that in a really compelling way. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you for listening. And yeah, hopefully, this is the first of many book reports. And in the show notes, I will include a link to the to Cal Penn's website and to the book link, so you can find out more information. The only critique I will say is that the one link on the website to where you can purchase the book is to Amazon, and I very much discourage purchasing books from Amazon, because Amazon has really undermined the independent bookstore uh, business. And there's so many other places where you can buy books where more money goes to the actual author, you support local businesses, and it's not actually more expensive or that much more expensive. So I will also put in the show notes links to other places um, where you can buy the memoir, or again, you can listen to it as an audiobook. And if you have an account through your library, and if your library has an account, excuse me, if your library offers audiobooks, you can probably listen to it for free, which is how I was able to listen to it through the app Libby, Libby. Anyway, so I'll include a couple of non Amazon options of how you can acquire this book, including bookshop.org. I'll check to see that it's there. I'll also check about Better World Books. Those are just a couple of suggestions that are just in general better alternatives to Amazon. Again, that's bookshop.org and Better World Books. But I'll add those to the show notes. So, all right, book report number 1, You Can't Be Serious by Cal Penn. Thanks for listening. See you next time.